Welcome to Make It Conscious. This is Max, and today's video is called Jung's Warning to the West. So following on from the previous video where I talked about this famous quote from Jung, where in a letter to Dorothy Thompson in September 1949, Jung summarized by saying, "We have not understood yet that the discovery of the unconscious means an enormous spiritual task, which must be accomplished if we wish to preserve our civilization." So I've come back to this quote a few times, not least because of its starkness, but also its conciseness and how it really lays out the problem in that our very civilization is threatened by our own psychology. And firstly, that there was this discovery of an unconscious, even though Jung himself certainly didn't discover it. He built out a lot of ideas that pertain to this unconscious mind, the collective unconscious, the personal unconscious, archetypes. Even Freud didn't discover the unconscious. The term unconscious was actually coined by the philosopher Schelling. However, the idea of the unconscious is not a new idea by any stretch. It's just the way we think about it now and the way we think about it in Western philosophical and psychological terms, in an admittedly very intricate and elaborate way. That is what we call the unconscious mind. But the very hermetic idea, as above, so below, this implies an unconscious mind. There's the implication of an unconscious mind in pretty much all of the world religions, even though they may not refer to it in those terms. Certainly exoterically, they may not understand it in those terms. And I think that modern psychology, by and large, builds on what's come before and offers a more useful understanding of the unconscious mind. It doesn't take literally that which ought to be taken metaphorically or symbolically. So this whole letter, of which this quote here is really the end, is a very powerful letter, and I think it's worth reading because it very much relates to where we are right now. And if anything, it's just as true today as it was in 1949, 75 years ago, almost to the month here. So a bit of context. Dorothy Thompson was a journalist who was expelled from Nazi Germany prior to World War II because she openly disagreed with the Nazi regime. Now in 1949, at the time of this letter, Jung is writing to her. It's the start of the Cold War. He's lived through 2 world wars. He's seen the capacity for human destruction. He's seen the impacts of his own theories play out in the world. It must have been a very profound experience if you think about it. And he had a lot of very useful insight into the minds of the Nazis and of the Western world. And Jung is often incorrectly, very erroneously, labeled a Nazi sympathizer. Now, this clearly couldn't be further from the truth. Where would you fit such an idea within his overall thesis? And if you actually read the man's words himself, he talks about all the psychological disturbances that led to Hitler's rising up as a leader. He, in some places, refers to Hitler as a hero, and it's very important to clarify that he means that he embodied the hero archetype in the minds of the German people, not that he was literally a hero, if that wasn't already completely clear. Sadly, it's actually not completely clear. I think it's easy to take Jung out of context. Context is very important when reading Jung. Hence why I want to start by setting the scene here, talking about where we are in time. It's almost 75 years ago to the month, and it's the very start of the Cold War. So he's at the end of his own life, or at least near the end of his own life. He's 74 years old at this point in time. And so he's had a lot of experience by this point, and he has a lot to say about the direction of things, both a best case and a worst case. He can pinpoint the exact problem. He can say what it is we need to do in order to actually get through the problem. So he starts by saying, "Dear Mrs. Thompson, it is a pleasure to receive the letter of a normally intelligent person, in contrast to the evil flood of idiotic and malevolent insinuations I seem to have released in the USA." So he's obviously being a little bit facetious here. And I actually find it a very interesting introduction to the letter because, as I mentioned earlier, not only is context important to Jung, but it's, I think, by virtue of his intricacies and the depth that he went to and profundity with which he thought and wrote. Not that he got everything right, but he certainly was a genius. It's very common to see people read into Jung things that aren't necessarily there. And one of the things that is often misappropriated to Jung is this idea that everything's just a projection, or that if you have trouble in the world, or if you have trouble with other people, or if someone's attacking you, or if you feel disturbed by someone's behavior, it is or more or less only a reflection of your own inner conflict. Now, we have to be clear here, it can be that, and there's often at least a component of that. But there's also the opposite as well, and there's the need to see the world clearly. And what's never discussed, or at least never that I've seen, is the opposite problem of if we then have to outsource our ability to discern to other people, whether it's our coach or our therapist, telling us what we're seeing in the other person is really in ourselves, then we haven't escaped the problem of projection, because all we're doing is projecting our own ability to discern what we see in front of us onto someone else. We've just now placed our own inner sovereignty onto this person who's meant to be helping us. So here we can clearly see, and Jung talks about evil in many places, he was actually not afraid of calling out idiotic and malevolent behavior. And it's important that I wouldn't suggest we go around calling people names. Notice he's not doing that here. But we can certainly call behavior for what it is. I wouldn't suggest you label anything as idiotic, but you can certainly call out malevolent behavior, and it's quite important that we do. In fact, that's one of the things our Western culture at the moment is really missing, is the ability to accurately call out malevolence, not least in others, but in ourselves. Because there's a lot of malevolence out there, by the way. There's a lot of abuse of freedom, the use of freedom to violate others' freedom, which was Schelling's definition of evil. And a large part of our struggle and our problem is the inability to call that for what it is. But at the same time, it's also the inability to deal with the malevolence of the world because we haven't understood it in ourselves, or because we haven't integrated our own shadow aspects. And when I say in ourselves, that's not necessarily deliberate malevolence. It's not necessarily the abuse of freedom, so much as it may be a archaic desire for power, born for good reason. But the difference is it's not a deliberate, voluntary misuse of freedom, which humans are absolutely capable of doing as well. Either way, we need to call it for what it is. So Jung was certainly not afraid to call it as he saw it. He goes on, a political situation is the manifestation of a parallel psychological problem in millions of individuals. This problem is largely unconscious, which makes it a particularly dangerous one. It consists of a conflict between a conscious, ethical, religious, philosophical, social, political, and psychological standpoint, and an unconscious one, which is characterized by the same aspects, but represented in a lower, i.e. more archaic form. So there's some pretty obvious reasons why I'm discussing this letter today. There's always tension, there's always the possibility of conflict in our world. There's usually some sort of international conflict going on somewhere. But right now we have the war in Ukraine, of course, and we have the very precarious possibility of an escalation in the Middle East between Hezbollah and Israel. Not to mention we have economic disturbances coming to the forefront, which have been cooking for a century or so. And we have weapons manufacturers in the USA reaching all-time highs in their stock price. So things are feeling pretty precarious. And even though this was written at the very start of the Cold War, which supposedly ended in 1991, but you see, that is really a surface level manifestation of what Jung is talking about here. It's a political situation that is actually the manifestation of a parallel psychological problem in the people themselves, in millions of individuals. So believing ourselves to be one way, this is the conscious standpoint, the ethical, religious, philosophical, social, political, and psychological. I don't know if we need to classify them all necessarily. It's just the way we postulate ourselves in the world. So what we're seeing is a grand scale persona-shadow dynamic. We the good guys, over there the bad guys, therefore justifying any kind of response, any kind of reaction. This is the terrifying danger, but it is also a direct result of those aspects in ourselves that we disapprove of I'd even go so far to say as that which we hate about ourselves. And you see that evidence of self-hatred everywhere. He goes on here, instead of high Christian ethics, the laws of the herd, suppression of individual responsibility, and submission to the tribal chief, totalitarian ethics. So he's also put the word high here in speech marks, and he's referring to the principles of Christianity, not how it is often practiced. And he's clearly saying that Western culture is built on the philosophy of individual responsibility. How could it not be? That's the reason why whatever success has been had in our world is due to that. It's due to the willingness of individuals to take responsibility. And that in part is at least encouraged by doctrines that encourage that can take one so far. They can take one to a point. But in today's world, we have to go much further than that, because there's always someone else to project onto. There's always someone else to dump your energy onto or regard as other, an enemy. There's always someone other in this world. So that's one of the key reasons why we have to focus now on self-knowledge. He goes on, instead of religion, superstitious belief in an ad hoc doctrine or truth. Now, this is interesting because when we say religion in the modern sense, I think a lot of folks would pretty much consider that as meaning an ad hoc doctrine and a superstitious belief. Just whatever happens to be there, that's what we happen to believe, and what's not superstitious about that. So when he says religion here, he doesn't mean exoteric organized religion. Remember, this was written in the late 40s, and his use of the word religion here may be partly because of English not being his first language, but also I think because in those days, the meanings of the word religious and spiritual there's more overlap between them. Now we might say spirituality, or I would actually prefer the term self-knowledge, because I think even the term spirituality is A, not very self-explanatory to most folks, and B, has a lot of baggage of its own now, and it conjures up all kinds of imagery that doesn't really explain or help us understand what it really is. So I might even say, instead of a genuine pursuit of self-knowledge, there is just the superstitious, comforting, impulsive grasping at whatever philosophy seems to help me get by. And often it's a product of circumstance, and it's a product of not being willing or not having to think for oneself. Although not necessarily. There's nothing inherently wrong with a religion, and it's just the confusion of the ideas for reality and the confusion of the mythical for the literal. So he goes on, a low-grade doctrinary system which rationalizes the appetites of the herd. That's a similar kind of point. And then, instead of a differentiated social organization, a meaningless, chaotic agglomeration of uprooted individuals kept under by sheer force and terror and blindfolded by appropriate lies. Instead of a constructive use of political power with the aim of attaining an equilibrium of freely developing forces, a destructive tendency to extend suppression over the whole world through attaining mere superiority of power. And then lastly, instead of psychology, use of psychological means to extinguish the individual spark and to inhibit the development of consciousness and intelligence. So here he's talking again about the danger of self-avoidance. All of these are forms of that. Whether it's the use of political power to destroy and extend suppression, because why would you want to do that if it wasn't for reasons of avoiding your own inner work? And then the use of psychology to extinguish the individual spark. So psychology too is a double-edged sword. And if you didn't know that Jung was a champion of individuality, you know it now. So you cannot really use Jung's psychology, certainly his later life psychology, to uphold something that's anti that. And one way in which that's often done is that idea of that everything's a projection, which there's truth and untruth in that. And it becomes very insidious when we start believing that everything we observe in the world is just our own shadow. And, that's at best a form of gaslighting, and at worst, an introjected or an internalized form of gaslighting done to oneself. So it would seem from this that Jung didn't really subscribe to those views. He goes on, you can find this conflict in nearly every citizen of any Western nation, but one is mostly unconscious of it. In Russia, the unconscious half of the conflict has reached the surface and has replaced civilized consciousness. That is what we fear might happen to ourselves too. We are afraid of this schizophrenia all the more since Germany has clearly demonstrated that even a civilized community can be seized by such a mental catastrophe, as it were, overnight. So, in recent years in the West, we have some very watered down equivalent of this in our own lives. I mean, we've seen the way that civilized so-called culture can flip overnight and start behaving very strangely. I think what we've seen since 2020 has woken a lot of people up to the capacity of humankind to do that. But one thing we tend not to do very well as a society is to learn from history. It's to take note of the lessons of our grandparents and great-grandparents. We struggle to do that even beyond a couple of generations. And we really need to learn to get better at learning about history, to learn to get better at learning. Doesn't mean that we don't have to go through some challenges of our own. We can't just download wisdom. It's not possible. But we can certainly make use of the lessons intellectually and then integrate them in our own experience on a less destructive scale. So this was only 74 years ago, and this is even being forgotten, let alone the circumstances that led to World War II or World War I. So the other side of this idea is this very engagement with the unconscious mind that this implies. It's two sides of the same coin. Coming to know ourselves is actually synonymous with learning from history, but it's also applying mythological and historical events to our own lives so we can truly understand them. If we just go in blind and oblivious to how similar situations have unfolded in the past, then they may actually destroy us before we can learn the lesson. So here he's saying that this proclivity that humans have to want to see themselves as high and mighty and yet hiding a very evil and destructive form of that same inclination, that is something that most are almost entirely unconscious of. And that is what's giving rise to international conflict in exactly the same way as it is today, and with potentially even larger consequences. So he outlines 6 bullet point lessons here. He says, thus, we have got to realize, 1, we are not immune. So just on that, by default, we're not immune. However, we can immunize ourselves, and that is the individuation process. That is inner work. But generally speaking, the society as a whole is certainly not immune. Point 2, the destructive powers are right there in ourselves. Yes, of course. But whether or not we're conscious of them is a different question. 3, the more unconscious they are, the more dangerous. So it's not merely a question of being conscious or unconscious, but how conscious are we? If there's layers to this stuff. This is not a 5-minute job, but nonetheless, if they're completely unconscious, then they are completely dangerous and life-threatening. We are threatened from within as well as from without. So this is where things get a little bit tricky, and the mechanics of this tends to confuse a lot of people. Perhaps because in one hand we're raised on a materialist information diet, and secondly because there's just the resistance to seeing this, which is quite natural. It's not saying that the outer threat is our own inner threat. There is such a thing as outer threat because everyone has free will. And so if everyone has free will, then it doesn't matter how you behave. Someone else always has the free will to come and harm you or take something from you. And there's, broadly speaking, 3 ways to respond to that. There's the possibility of being completely passive and being completely victimized and not even resisting at all. There's the opposite. There's the ability to not only defend, but then to go into offense mode, to perhaps channel that same energy back to fight and maybe use unreasonable force, take any opportunity to basically do to others what, way more than what that person is doing to you. You see this a lot in any story from the Western world, especially in the States, it has to be said, where someone breaks into the home and maybe they try to steal something. terrible thing to do, sure. But someone's just rubbing their hands with glee like they've been waiting for an opportunity to commit murder and shoot this person. So one can hardly claim to be upholding righteousness if they take any opportunity to destroy another human life. If that person's creating a threat to you, then they've sort of brought it on themselves. And Jung seemed to agree with that, as we'll see in a moment. But if it's disproportional, then it actually shows there's a inner conflict there, because it's like, on one hand, one is purporting to uphold justice and righteousness. They presumably do not want harmful things to occur in the world. They do not like being robbed. They presumably don't like being shot themselves. But on the other hand, they're willing to do something really extreme and commit way more harm to the other person than that person was ever actually doing to them. So it's like, are you serving harm or unharm? Are you serving power or are you serving justice? So it's not that everything's a projection, right? It's not that we create in that literal direct way the threat from outside. But there's this third way to engage with the threat from without. And that is to recognize it, to understand exactly what it is. And that involves understanding the misuse of freedom in that situation. It means understanding the drivers at play. And certainly it involves understanding what is it in ourselves that's there that we need to bring to the surface that we're seeing in the other as well. Doesn't mean it's not there, but it does mean that there's something in it for us. It's not just a question of, if only we had the right laws, or if only we all shared the right values, then maybe things would be better. No, because that would be to misunderstand the whole reason we exist here as humans, right? It's a self-knowledge journey, and there's always something in it for us. And when we can integrate that, and the more we integrate it, because there's many layers to it, the more the problem will transform. So the more we can actually honor what there is, which is freedom. So if we were to take either of those first two options, we're not really honoring freedom, because in the first option, we're betraying ourselves. And in the second option, we're really betraying someone else as much as they might have done something harmful. But in the third option, we're actually synthesizing those two. We're sublating into something that's more aligned with what there is. So he goes on, 5, we cannot destroy the enemy by force. We should not even try to overcome Russia, because we would destroy ourselves, since Russia is, as it were, identical with our unconscious, which contains our instincts and all the germs of our future development. This is key, and that's what I was just saying, really. But here, isn't this interesting? Russia is identical with our unconscious. It doesn't mean literally. He means the shadow in particular here. But that actually it represents so much of ourselves, in this case the West, that yes, it's all the things we cannot stand about ourselves that we're seeing in the other and therefore feel justified in combating. But at the same time, it also contains the germs of our future development. So remember, this is just a few years after the end of World War II, when the USA and Russia were on the same side, had a common enemy. But almost the moment that enemy is defeated, suddenly they're starting to look each other up and down suspiciously. It almost sounds like a sort of dysfunctional relationship, doesn't it? Like things are going great under certain conditions and all's going well when you're getting your own needs met. But the moment those conditions change, suddenly you're no longer getting your needs met and they're seeing each other as enemies without calling themselves that yet. So, this is proof that there isn't that inner work being done. And how can a country do inner work? The country is just a group of people, right? Exactly. It goes back to that first quote that the political situation is really just a psychological situation shared by millions of people, or it's a theme that's showing up in millions of people. And so lastly here, point 6, he says, the unconscious must be slowly integrated without violence and with due respect for our ethical values. This needs many alterations in our religious and philosophical views. So Jung didn't often talk about how to do this. He talks about his psychology, but he didn't really, for example, prescribe much about how to do active imagination. And there's bits and pieces here and there, but in terms of the techniques that his psychology led to, that's largely been led on by other people. And he also has not really ever said anything along the lines of what it means to individuate in daily life, what that might actually involve. how to do it. I think we can learn a lot from the way he lived his own life, the way he spoke. So it's a question of do as they do and take on board what they say and understand how it applies to your own life. But here seems to be a rare occasion where he's saying, firstly, that the unconscious must be slowly integrated, because one way to encounter the unconscious is simply to go to war. That might be quite a rash approach, and that's not exactly doing so with due respect for our ethical values. And it may be such a tumultuous encounter that we might not actually survive it. Probably pretty likely not to survive it. And the second sentence here about the need for alterations in our views. So always be engaging with the world and transforming with it. I often refer to this as habit one. This is take responsibility for your mind. And it also involves empathy, because empathy is the willingness to transform, to experience the world through yourself, to experience the other, and to mutually transform with it. But it's this very resistance to change and transformation that leads to evil and that leads to the kinds of international conflicts that we're, again, on the precipice of manifesting. So this is interesting. He goes on, the West is forced to rearmament. We have to be ready for the worst, but no attack, under no condition. Russia can only defeat herself. We cannot defeat our instincts, but they can inhibit each other, and they do if you allow them to run freely within certain limits, i.e. only so far that they don't just kill you. You shoot when you are threatened in your very existence, not when you are merely hurt in your feelings or in your traditional convictions. So, clearly Jung was not a pacifist, and this relates to the point I just made about those three ways of engaging with a threat. Passive being one of them, the other one being aggressive, and the third being that middle way that understands the other and understands the self, and therefore was able to take the wisdom from both those positions and synthesize it into a middle way. But you see, the tricky thing is that what we might often think of as a defense or call a defense is actually a form of attack, and that's often how these things escalate. One feels justified in attacking, calling it a kind of defense. And it's very easy to convince oneself of that if you feel threatened. But as Jung said, having your feelings hurt is not the same as being threatened. And actually having hurt feelings may, and this is the important distinction, it may be a case of genuine harm that's been done, or it may be a case of simply not having our own preferences met. And that may arise from repressed unconscious material. So we have to be really incisive into what's going on inside ourselves here. We do well not just to assume that because we don't like something that therefore there's something evil going on, when there isn't necessarily. But spotting that is a really important skill. And curiously, when one develops that skill, it's often not the case that you start to see less evil in the world. You actually start to see more evil in the world often when you develop that skill. Maybe it's different for different people, but often what we actually think is just something that we've done or that we've overreacted or something. Hey, the other possibility is that, no, we haven't. Actually, we have correctly spotted something that's going on here. We have had our freedom violated and have been convinced or gaslit that that isn't something that's occurred. So it's very important to be discerning. He goes on, it seems to me that at the bottom of all these problems lies the development of science and technology, which has destroyed man's metaphysical foundation. Social welfare has replaced the kingdom of God. So I think it's unlikely that Jung has turned his back on psychology here and determined it's actually technology that has caused all these problems. Actually, it's that these two things are very interrelated. So it is a psychological issue, but it's also a technological issue. And these things have arisen together. He does say that science and technology have destroyed man's metaphysical foundation. I do think that they've become distractions, because the pursuit of science and technology starts out as a pursuit of self-knowledge. You understand the world, you understand yourself, and you cannot do one without the other. But it can very quickly become an avoidance of that as well, because beyond a point, it's not really about understanding the world, it's really about modeling the world to a useful degree. But the moment one confuses the model for the reality or an explanation, then it's no longer understanding the world, it's actually the opposite. It's a distraction away from true understanding. And in that sense, it's also a distraction away from true self-knowledge. So in that way, the development of science and technology, or the obsession with it, has indeed destroyed man's metaphysical foundation. The idea that we can use technology to just support everybody and have everyone's needs met. There's some benevolence in that, I think. There's also a lot of malevolence in that. And there are many people in this world, who are smart enough to understand that is not going to solve many problems. He even says here that, look, social welfare has become the lure, the bait and the slogan for the uprooted masses, which can only think in terms of personal needs and resentments. But they don't see there is no escape from the law of compensation. The law of compensation. So you cannot just solve all your problems by making sure that everyone has a roof, or that everyone has a universal basic income and has their basic needs met. It gives rise to new problems. And it's really the attitude that's the challenge. And with that, a lack of understanding of psychology and the unconscious mind within that. Because we always have problems, right? But it's how we relate to those problems and what we do with them. Do we use them as fuel for moving forward, becoming more conscious in ourselves, or do we just use an array of coping mechanisms to relieve our tension in the short term and thus become ever more neurotic over time? So he goes on, their Marxist philosophy is based upon the conviction that the river, once in the future, can be persuaded to flow upwards. They don't see that they themselves have to pay for this stunt by unending suffering. Much better to know, therefore, that life on this earth is balanced between an equal amount of pleasure and misery, even when it is at its best, and the real progress is only the psychological adaptation to the various forms of individual misery. He's sounding quite Freudian here. You see, he's saying that pleasure and misery, one might assume pleasure is good, right, and misery is bad, almost kind of by default, I suppose. But actually, maybe these are 2 points on an axis that is neither better nor worse. They exist in relation to each other. And that real progress is psychological adaptation to the various forms of misery. So therefore, regress would be maladaptation to the challenges that life inevitably brings. The daily discomfort and misery, but also all the joy that comes with that as well. See, it's about how we relate to that. Understanding that's not a bad thing unto itself. This actually facilitates and acts as a guardrail to the development of self-knowledge. If we didn't suffer, there'd be no meaning, there'd be no upwards trajectory, there'd be no coming to consciousness. So it's not that suffering causes consciousness per se, it's almost that it's a prerequisite for it. In order to aspire to consciousness, well, you cannot have that without suffering, because otherwise, how would you know when you were becoming misaligned and divided in yourself? So that energetic tension we experience as suffering, and it's not a bad thing. Of course, from some perspective, suffering is bad. That's the whole point of it. And yet it's also purposeful. And that purpose actually serves an end. So, if you just judge existence itself as bad because it contains suffering, it's a problem with how the mind's relating to it in that case. So he goes on, we all think in terms of social welfare. That is a big mistake, because the more you economize on the vulgar forms of misery, the more you are ensnared by new, unexpected, complicated, intricate, incomprehensible variants of unhappiness, such as you have never dreamt of before. Think of the almost uncanny increase of divorces and neuroses. I must say, I prefer a modest poverty or any tangible discomfort. For example, no bathroom, no electricity, no car, etc., to those pests. Brilliant. So, as long as we try and just fix all these problems over here, it's like playing whack-a-mole. There's just going to be more that appear, and there'll be issues that we hadn't even thought of before. And this is sort of the price we're paying now for believing that we can just craft things a certain way and have this perfect world where everyone gets on, everyone shares the same value system, everyone speaks the same language, and then we'll just have all our needs met and then everything will be fine. No, we will create additional problems. We need to, because otherwise the fuel for growth is gone. But if we change our relationship to those issues, then I'd say that is actually the beginning of true self-knowledge, because it changes your whole experience of suffering. Yeah, of course, there's still suffering, but understanding why it's there, its existence, and that there's actually meaning on the other side of it as well. There's different kinds of suffering. He goes on, the bitter social progress attained by Nazi Germany and Russia is compensated for by police terror, a new and very considerable item on the list of miseries, but an inevitable consequence of social welfare. Why not spiritual welfare? There is no government on earth bothering much about it. Yet spiritual adjustment is the problem. Because, firstly, governments don't exist to facilitate spiritual welfare. Can you imagine if a typical Western government today started talking about spiritual welfare? Can you imagine what a calamity that would be, and how awfully misguided that any kind of program like that would inevitably be? It would be unlikely to make any difference or be taken seriously by anyone. There's no getting around the need for personal responsibility, so you might as well just start there and pretty much leave it there and let the rest fall into place. He goes on, if we understand what Russia is in ourselves, we know how to deal with her politically. Now that might just be the headline. So this really pertains to that middle way I mentioned earlier. It's all about being aggressive. It's all about being passive. It's about understanding and knowing what the other is in ourselves. And be very honest about that, even though it might be uncomfortable. We're not afraid of a bit of discomfort, are we? A bit of self-reflection never hurt anyone. Well, it did actually, and that's kind of the point. But no one ever died from self-reflection, and things only ever got better because of it. So only when you truly know yourself can you actually know the other, and only then can you actually respond to them as they really are. Any response that doesn't consider how they really are is going to escalate problems either for you or the other. And so either way, it comes back around. And he ends on this famous quote here, which I've already read. We have not understood yet that the discovery of the unconscious means an enormous spiritual task, which must be accomplished if we wish to preserve our civilization. So I've talked about this quote at length before, and this is what Making Conscious is really about. It's about understanding the unconscious. And it's about the enormous spiritual task that is individuation, that is becoming undivided in yourself, it's engaging with the unconscious mind. And it's about understanding that there are consequences of our unwillingness to do this. But that's not really it's not meant to be a sort of stick approach. It's actually very beneficial to do this for yourself. And it's the privilege of a lifetime to become who you truly are. So there's some great benefits that come out of it. It's not just about preventing war, but it's the unwillingness to do this inner work, to do any inner work, that is leading to the conflicts and the tensions that we see right now. So this whole letter by Jung to Dorothy Thompson is just as relevant now as it was 75 years ago. And it's almost the month that it was released. So it's as good a time as any to be studying these words, taking it on board. And with that, I will thank you, and I shall see you in the next video.